Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the opening plenary of Geneva Trade Week 2021. Thank you to those of you who are in the room here today, having braved the COVID screening. Thank you to those of us dialing in via Zoom, and of course to those of you watching us live on YouTube. My name is Dmitry Grozobinski. I'm the Executive Director of the Geneva Trade Platform, which is housed here at the Graduate Institute within its Center for Trade and Economic Integration. Let me begin with the most important duty, which is offering thanks. Geneva Trade Week would not be possible without the support of the Graduate Institute and the Center for Trade and Economic Integration, or the generous contributions of the Geneva Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Sergei Popov, and the United Kingdom's Department of International Trade, as well as the Brazilian Permanent Mission to the WTO. It would also not have been possible without some truly tireless and inspiring work from our phenomenal events team and our student volunteers, all led by Juanita Calabala, who I promise will eventually get to have a vacation. It also wouldn't have been possible without the creativity and vision of our creative directors, Professors Richard Baldwin and Joost Pualen. As always, any successes during the week are entirely due to other people, and any failures are entirely my fault. Today's opening plenary session serves two purposes. First, it gives me a chance to welcome you to Geneva Trade Week and talk through our program a little bit. And second is our main event, a discussion of trade and peace building, for which we are blessed with some truly incredible speakers. Immediately following my remarks and subject to the vagaries of Zoom, I will hand the floor to our first keynote speaker, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Director General of the World Trade Organization, in what I am told will be her first public formal remarks on the Trade for Peace initiative. We're tremendously honored to have her join us. After we hear from the Director General, we will give the floor to the Honorable Jose Ramos Horta, the former President of Timor-Leste, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and the special envoy of the G7 Plus group at WTO Accession group. With the keynotes concluded, I will yield the floor to our illustrious panel and to our moderator, Professor Joost Pualen, who is Professor of International Law and Head of the International Law Department here at the Graduate Institute. Joost also grades many of the students in the room, so if you hear applause or suspiciously pandering questions, that's probably why. In Joost's capable hands will be Ambassador Xiangshang Zhang, Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization. Welcome, sir. Ms. Dorothy Tembo, Deputy Executive Director of the International Trade Center, and Dr. Kim Wenham, who is both the Director of Strategic Partnerships here at the Graduate Institute and a Senior Researcher at the Center on Conflict, Development, and Peace Building. Welcome to you all, and thank you all for joining us. Today's opening plenary on Trade for Peace is important in its own right, obviously, but it's also just the opening act of Geneva Trade Week. This year, with the WTO Public Forum roaring back into our calendar with over 100 exciting sessions, Geneva Trade Week looks very different from what you might have seen last year. In consultation with our friends and partners at the WTO Secretariat, we have endeavored to develop a program that slots neatly in and around the public forum. Our primary objective is to enhance the experience of public forum attendees wherever in the world they would be, and add just those little cherries on the cake. To that end, the beating heart of Geneva Trade Week is the brand new virtual convention hall, which we've built using the GatherTown platform. This large virtual space, accessible free and instantly from your browser, allows you to seamlessly meet and mingle with attendees from all over the world. It's far less formal than launching a Zoom and more spontaneous. Our digital convention hall version of Geneva and the Graduate Institute will formally open tomorrow, but you're welcome to check it out as at the end of this plenary. The convention hall has lots to see and is filled with private spaces where you can have a bilateral or group discussion simply by moving to a table, couch, or booth. While GTW 2021 will be the convention hall's formal debut, the hall itself is a more permanent offering. It's our gift to the trade policy community. We would love to share it with any organization that wants to bring a touch of whimsy and spontaneity that you might get at a real-life meeting or conference to an event that's hybrid or virtual. Beyond the convention hall, our program includes a range of different offerings from the traditional to the very, very experimental, designed specifically for communities that aren't always heard in Geneva, or that Trade Policy Geneva may sometimes struggle to speak to. I won't list all of our events, but if you'll indulge me, I would love to share a sample with you. Shortly after this opening plenary, our friends at the TESS Forum, with the help of a great panel, will present an update on environmental negotiations and member initiatives around the environment heading into the 12th Ministerial Conference. Then, to continue on that theme, tomorrow morning, the Executive Director of the International Trade Centre, Pamela Cook-Hamilton, will join Ambassador Simon Manley of the United Kingdom to discuss, for a fireside discussion of the road to COP26, what small businesses are thinking about climate change adaptation and how to tell a more positive story about climate change adaptation. Geneva Trade Week also offers opportunities for training and learning. Our program includes walkthroughs and how-to guides on two formidable policy analysis tools: the powerful Global Trade Alerts database and the newly launched UNCTAD database tracking global trade flows across the life cycle of plastics. These are phenomenally powerful tools for anyone who wants to impact or understand policy. Being based here at the Graduate Institute and with so much of the week facilitated by our outstanding student assistants, we couldn't help but build a program that centers students, young professionals, and the next generation of policy wonks who will bore people at parties with rules of origin trivia. We will mark the start of the World Trade of the WTO Public Forum with what I think might be the first ever student watch party. We will invite students from all over the world to join us in watching the opening plenary of WTO Public Forum, while an illustrious panel of experts comments live, before finally we turn the microphone over to the students themselves and encourage them to have their say. It is an experiment and it will either go disastrously or spectacularly, but nothing in between. Also, as part of our student program, we have briefings from the Trade Lab Clinic, an interactive panel on how to choose and be chosen from top trade law firms around the world, presentations from specialists on the future of the labor market and how to navigate it. I would also be remiss if I didn't flag a very special session on Wednesday afternoon. At 2 p.m., a group of students, some of which I think might be in the room today, will be presenting a paper first conceived through the G2 hackathon, which happened earlier this year, on practical steps the WTO can take to improve transparency and robustness in the personal protective equipment, or PPE, supply chain. I can't think of a stronger validation for the idea to send to students than to see an idea developed by a group of students from the Graduate Institute take shape and go from that rough idea to an imminently formally published paper presented at a CUTS Geneva session and with discussants the caliber of the Swedish ambassador to the WTO and Professor Gabriel Marceau of the WTO. On that uplifting note, let me come back to the theme of our session today: trade for peace. Recalling my own time here as a trade delegate, I don't think I considered peace building to be unimportant or irrelevant. It was simply distant. I had been told and I believed that improved trade leads to more robust peace, and peace building in turn facilitates trade. Therefore, my modus operandi, my assumption was that provided I did my job and my colleagues in the peace building community did theirs, we didn't need to engage with one another or really enter into one another's world. With a little bit more gray in my hair, most of it caused by Geneva Trade Weeks, I know that that's patently absurd. The way trade flows, how it's organized, who benefits and who loses, who has a voice at the table that sets the regulations that guide it, is inexorably tied to maintaining peace, building peace, and yes, sometimes if done wrong, the breakdown of peace. Moreover, any trade policy process from a WTO accession to a free trade negotiation that operates blind to the complexities peace builders operate in is liable to damage peace rather than foster it. So we couldn't be more excited to be able to highlight Trade for Peace at this plenary. The Geneva Trade Platform was designed in large part to help break down the siloed nature of the conversation around trade policy, to invite in other communities like peace building to practice in our world and bring some of our world into their practice. Supporting the Trade for Peace initiative was therefore an obvious choice from us, and this high-level opening plenary is just the first of 3 sessions we'll have focused on Trade for Peace over the next coming days. Tomorrow in our virtual convention hall, Ms. Julia Kroos and Dr. Galina Kothukiewicz will present the key findings of their forthcoming paper, WTO Accessions, a way to boost peace for fragile and conflict-affected states. Then, on Wednesday, former Minister of Liberia, Axel Ardi, will host a conversation on the origins of the Trade for Peace initiative, which will double as a recording of the Trade for Peace podcast. And we hope you can join us for both. Let me, however, return to the present. Our first keynote speaker, who I can see has joined us, has embraced, I think, more than any other Director General before her, or perhaps any in my living memory, the leadership role that the World Trade Organization can play in bringing together at the level required diverse constituencies that each hold a piece of a trade policy or a global puzzle. Whether in tackling COVID-19 vaccine or equipment supply chain bottlenecks or supporting initiatives like this one, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala has rolled up her sleeves and that of her organization and waded in to do the hard work of collaboratively building a better future. That she is here today, sparing us a few minutes, despite the 12th Ministerial Conference being right around the corner, and the formidable work that that entails, is a tremendous honor and an immense privilege, and I'm honored to offer her the floor. Director General, welcome.
Well, thank you so much for that generous welcome, and it's wonderful to be with you. This is my first time. So, Excellencies, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, it's really my great pleasure to join you to open this 2021 Geneva Trade Week under the theme, Trade for Peace. I want to thank the Geneva Trade Platform for their efforts to raise awareness about the role of trade policy in addressing global challenges. Your work complements what we're doing at the WTO this week at the Public Forum, bringing even more voices to the trade policy conversation. Ideas matter, and you are in the business of trade policy ideas. It's an honor to share this platform with the Honorable Dr. Jose Ramos-Horta, former President of Timor-Leste, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and Special Envoy of the G7+. Trade and peace are completely intertwined in the history of the multilateral trading system, though many have forgotten this. Scarred by the experience of the Great Depression and the Second World War, the architects of the post-1945 economic order sought to foster economic integration on the grounds that where goods do not cross borders, soldiers will. And yet, trade and peace today are not often mentioned in tandem, as has already been said. Each has its own community and constituency. But trade, poverty, and peace remain intricately connected. The World Bank estimates that by 2030, up to 2/3 of the world's people in extreme poverty will be living in the 30 or so fragile and conflict-affected countries. These are often the places least integrated into global trade. That is why it is particularly valuable that the Graduate Institute, which hosts both the trade and peace-building platforms, has started to break down the silos separating the two communities. We will need multidisciplinary thinking and inclusive approaches to use trade to create economic opportunities in fragile and conflict-affected states. Even in these difficult times of the pandemic and natural disasters resulting from climate change, trade can help build resilience, including in fragile and conflict-affected countries. by helping improve access to food and much needed medical supplies, which in turn helps to build peace. The fundamental objective of multilateral cooperation, Article 1 of the United Nations Charter, is the maintenance of international peace and security. At the WTO, we insist that trade is not an end in itself, but a means to an end. Trade can support growth, poverty reduction, and socioeconomic inclusion. The economists Paul Collier, my former colleague, and Anke Hoffler have documented that in poor countries with a history of civil conflict, higher per capita economic growth is associated with a decreased risk of resumed hostilities, and vice versa. So while the multilateral trading system has helped deliver prosperity, peace, and poverty reduction on a scale its architects could scarcely have imagined, these benefits have not extended to all countries. In December 2017, a group of fragile and conflict-affected least developed countries seeking to join the WTO came together as the G7 plus WTO accessions group. Currently led by Liberia and Timor-Leste, the group also includes the Comoros, Sao Tome and Principe, Somalia, South Sudan, and Sudan. They see a role for the WTO in supporting them to use trade integration to promote peace and stability and to move from fragility to resilience. The WTO Secretariat's Accession Division has been working with the Graduate Institute to support the G7 Plus group to realize its vision. The partnership started with a capstone study prepared by a group of 3 master's students entitled Trade for Peace, examining the role of WTO membership in fostering peace in the Horn of Africa. This study laid down key questions and issues on the nexus between trade and peace. A contribution made by this study was a review of peace-related clauses in trade agreements and trade and economic clauses in peace agreements. It is noteworthy that out of 558 trade agreements registered at the WTO in its database, only 10, or about 1 in 50, contain peace-related clauses, mostly in trade deals negotiated by the European Union. Meanwhile, 157 out of the 828 peace agreements registered in the UN Peacemaker database, nearly 1 in 5 of these contain various types of economic or trade-related clauses. The references range from regional economic cooperation, about 47 of these, and the free movement of goods, to economic justice, customs, economic good governance, and resource management. The study calls for further analysis, including to examine whether conflicts that ultimately necessitated peace agreements were fueled by impediments to trade, and to formulate a, quote, model peace agreement, unquote, with trade clauses designed to promote lasting peace. There is also a strong case for deepening the knowledge available on the sociopolitical and economic conditions that enable trade to support peace, looking at issues from climate change to job creation. I hope these ideas will provide some food for thought on possible areas of collaboration between the trade and peace communities that come together at the Graduate Institute. Ultimately, the goal is to bring together expertise and knowledge that will enable trade to nurture peace and peace building. I'm confident your discussions will advance our thinking on how to make trade work for people everywhere, including in fragile and conflict-affected countries. I wish you a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Director General, for your kind words and your insight. I think the fact that you mentioned the silos and our role in breaking them down is vital, because I think it is critical that in breaking down those silos, we have champions like yourselves and like Marie-Laure, the Director of our Graduate Institute, and like those on the panel today, because those silos are formidably high and hard to climb out of. So thank you so much, and thank you for sparing the time to join us today.
Thank you and good luck.
Due in part, I suspect, to the tyranny of time zones, our next keynote speaker couldn't join us in person, but he has asked us to share a video message with you all in his absence. It is therefore my pleasure to introduce in absentia the Honorable Jose Ramos Horta, former President of Timor-Leste, a Nobel Prize laureate and Special Envoy of the G7+.
Excellency Dr. Ngozi, WTO Director General, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, greetings from Timor-Leste. I pray for your well-being and happiness and of all around you. On behalf of the G7+ group, I thank you for inviting me and peace, the twin interrelated components of the G7+ group. International Peace Day was commemorated a week ago against the dark background of the international community's abysmal failure in rescuing the more than 1 billion people living in conflict-affected countries, where peace is an elusive, precious commodity. Their prayers for peace and well-being have gone unheeded. Wars and the security crisis are so pervasive, almost a matter of routine, that there is hardly a family that has been spared. Generations have grown in wars and destitution. Despite the unmatchable resilience of their people, these countries are labeled fragile, failing, or failed states. These so-called fragile states have for decades and even centuries fueled the engines of wealth of the industrialized nations with human and natural resources, yet they are home to the world's poorest. The sometimes invisible and forgotten colonization legacies, exacerbated by proxy wars, foreign aggression, and violent extremism, overwhelm the brave peoples of these war-torn countries, who have shown extraordinary courage and resilience in the fight for lasting peace, democracy, self-reliance, and development. Regime changes, foreign interference, and man-made and natural crises have become the recurring fate of these people. The global norms and policies guiding development aid and stability have further proved to be unworkable for these countries. Too often, international cooperation in peace and development has failed to achieve lasting social and economic development. As if the litany of man-made and natural catastrophes have not sufficed, there appear the COVID-19 pandemic and the global recession that wiped out the gains of the last 20 years. Compounded by institutional and economic fragility, the impacts of COVID-19 will last much longer in countries such as those in the G7+. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we tend to measure global development by the aggregate social and economic indicators, and hence we feel proud that our world has become more peaceful, stable, and less poor and more equitable. This is partly true. For instance, the main powers engaged in the two world wars of 20th century have not been in direct confrontation since 1945. These powers have developed on every aspect of life. However, this is not true for conflict-affected countries. They have instead become breeding ground for extreme poverty, battlefield for the Cold War, and subject to proxy wars enhance humanitarian and international peace missions with stratospheric cost tags. They are left further behind on all of these indicators. They are now on the opposite extreme of the development axis. Their citizens have been at the mercy of foreign aid despite living on untapped natural resources worth trillions of dollars. Extreme inequality is rising among countries and regions. However globalized and interconnected our world has become, we are deeply divided across social and economic standards. This can be nothing but the result of flawed international policies that have benefited only few, while depriving majority of others of the gains they are entitled to. Therefore, and against this background, I would like to summarize in 3 points the shared perspective of G7+. First, for the case, the right to equal and equitable participation of least developed and especially conflict-affected countries in global trade and cooperation have been denied. Trade has remained the premise of few major global powers who have used multilateralism in trade and cooperation for the benefits of narrowly defined geostrategic ends. Multilateralism can no more survive on the pretext of balance of power among the mighty nations. It can only prosper if it becomes more inclusive and equitable, and hence truly multilateral. Therefore, we call upon the leadership of the World Trade Organization to pursue reform in its policies that can be conducive to the true interests of world's least developed and conflict-affected countries. We, the G7+, through the G7 WTO Accession Group, offer our assistance in providing our perspective that is representative of the context of 1.5 billion people. Second, peace and stability in conflict-affected countries is a precondition for trade and hence development. Without peace, these countries cannot reap the fruits of trade and investment. Conflict in most of these countries is a product of interference, hegemonic quest by regional powers, as much as the legacy of colonization and the force of internal factors. While realizing the polarization of politics among the global powers, we need them to truly recognize the rights to peace and stability of citizens of conflict-affected countries in their own terms. In the globalized world, no one will be in peace until everyone is in peace. Third and final, conflict-affected and other least developed countries are rich in natural resources. However, their exploitation has rarely resulted in job creation and hence economic development. Due to lack of stability, infrastructure, institutional capacity, and resources, they are left behind in trade and hence economic prosperity. If they were to manage their resources effectively, they could sustain peace and stability and hence save the billions of dollars spent on humanitarian and peace missions every year. Therefore, international cooperation systems and policies should be reformed to become pro-peace and pro-stability for our countries. In conclusion, a gentle reminder that the multilateral trade system was created on the promise of shared prosperity. It is truly a time to ask ourselves if we have honored that promise. I truly hope this question finds honest answers during the trade week. I thank you all.
A lot to take away there, I think, and a really big question at the end that I am immensely grateful, I can pass over to Professor Llewellyn to answer. Just after a quick bit of housekeeping in terms of how the Q&A will run. When Professor Llewellyn calls for questions from the room, feel free to lift your hands up and a sanitized microphone will be brought to you. If you're joining us on Zoom, you can ask questions at any time using the Q&A function of Zoom, which is a black Q&A button right at the bottom of your Zoom window. And with that out of the way, please allow me to thank you one more time for joining us at Geneva Trade Week. We hope you enjoy everything that we have to offer this week. And then let me hand over proceedings to our moderator. Professor, the room is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Dimitri. I hope this is working. Thank you for the introduction and for setting the scene and introducing the two keynote speakers. And also, Dimitri, thank you for your tireless energy, enthusiasm, ideas, setting up last year's Geneva Trade Week, but also this year's Geneva Trade Week. Really, really delighted, and it's been a pleasure working with you. My role here is to moderate the opening plenary. I see the three speakers very well. I hardly see you in the room because of the lighting, but it's a delight to be here in person, and I hope this will stimulate a frank, open discussion amongst the three of you. The theme is on trade and peace, trade for peace, trade and peace building, which is an old theme, as old as trade itself. At the same time, it has popped up again as a huge new agenda in and outside of the WTO. This will be an exploratory discussion, and I'm delighted to have people from both communities. I think previous speakers have mentioned it. These communities tend to work in silos: trade negotiators, humanitarian, peace-building people. So from the trade side, we have Ambassador Zhang, Deputy Director General of the WTO. Welcome. And also Ms. Dorothy Tembo, Deputy Executive Director of the ITC, also here in Geneva. And from the other side of the fence, so to speak, we have Akim Wenman, who's a colleague of mine at the Graduate Institute, Director of Strategic Partnerships, but also very active substantively in the field of peace and peace building in our Center on Conflict Development and Peace Building. And Akim is also the former executive coordinator of Geneva Peace Building Platform. Now, we have about an hour, I think 55 minutes. And my goal is to field a few questions to our participants, give them the floor. Each of you can respond to the questions a couple of minutes and then respond to each other. And then I'd really like to turn to the audience for questions, because for many this will be a new theme. For others, they are delving deep into it and may want to field the question as well. So questions from the room, please think of questions, and also the audience online. If you have questions, you can post them online, and I think Dimitri will soon read them out. Okay, if I can start with the first question, because we can think about trade and peace from many different perspectives and in many different ways. The Director General of the WTO already mentioned it. It's actually quite telling that since the creation of the GATT in the 1940s, we haven't seen a big new Third World War or major conflict at the global universal level. So that's obviously a plus. On the other hand, as President Ramos Horta pointed out, and I was actually shocked by the number, I looked at the video beforehand. Today, there's still 1 billion people living in fragile and conflict-affected countries. So it's a real big issue, right? I want to ask our participants, what is new or different today when it comes to trade for peace? It's an old debate, but it's popping up again today. What is, from the perspective of your organization or your background, trade for peace, trade and peace building about? Why is it important today? And in practical terms, because I think there's a lot of people in the room, but also watching us, asking themselves, what does it mean for me, for my day-to-day life? What does this mean for real people? Perhaps I can start with Ambassador Zhang, who works for the WTO and who has really put this theme on the agenda recently. Ambassador?
Thank you, East. I'm very pleased to be invited to attend this session, Trade for Peace. And as Dr. Ngodi said, we assume, the trade people assume that trade is conducive for maintaining a sustainable peace. And the WTO itself and the multilateral trading system itself is the outcome of the international collective effort after the Second World War. And there's no the Third World War, and generally the world peace has been maintained for decades. But as we told that there are a lot of people are living in the conflicted affected countries, and we are in a globalization process, and the supply chain can be broken because of the conflict, and the turmoil, the turbulence can be spread quickly to each corner of the world. That's the reason why we need to discuss trade for peace now. That's the new connotation and the current circumstance, and that's the reason why in Buenos Aires in 2017, some countries like Afghanistan, like Liberia, like Somalia, the so-called G7+ countries organize this initiative, Trade for Peace. And you ask us to make a concrete response to the issue. And as you know, we are negotiating a fishery subsidy agreement among 164 members. It is a multilateral trading negotiation. But what relationship between this negotiation and the peace? And I was told by some African countries, delegates, they said, if all the fish along our shore were caught by the bigger fleet, you know, our fisheries, they have to be perished. That's the consequence. That's the relationship between, you know, the trading negotiation and the peace. I'm not saying that I would like to establish the causal linkage between trade and peace. It's more complicated, more sophisticated, but there is the correlationship between the two. So we need more knowledge about the relationship from the experts like Akim and Graduate Institute, and to establish the right correlation between the two. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very interesting and very concrete. Since the ITC deals with implementation, practical projects, perhaps I can first turn to Akim to talk a bit about my question from the perspective of peace building. How do you look at it? What's new? Why do you think it is really important?
Thank you so much, Joost, and it's a pleasure to be here with a task of representing the peace side of the house. So from our perspective, unfortunately, there has been a lot of conflict and security since the Second World War. It's been a never more complex and also more violent world in one way or the other. And research from the Graduate Institute shows that even today there's about one person dying violently every minute. So we have around 550 deaths due to violence, which occur globally every year, so that at the end of this panel, after 90 minutes, we can think, well, there are 90 people that will die violently. So this is just the reality of the peace and conflict perspective on this, where those who work on peace and peace mediation in this town, they're looking at any topics that can provide an entry point into building bridges of contesting parties. And very frequently, trade and trading relationships is one of this topic that for the parties is more important than fighting. Here in our language, this is called confidence building measures, where there are business councils which are working across conflict lines together, but also where you can inbuild incentives in order to strengthen collaboration and disincentivize, in fact, violence and conflict. But on a broader level, of course, and this is, I think, which is the second dimension of the Trade for Peace agenda from the peace side, it is a response to managing complexity. Because if we are looking at conflict-affected and fragile states, violence is one dimension. There's going to be more disruption due to climate change events. There are, of course, rising populations and the challenges of urbanization, which are very often the capitals of trade, will all interlink to create a much more unstable future. And this is where both the peace builders and we think also the trade and the humanitarian side, all of those constituencies, which we have on our doorsteps here in Geneva, we need to find a way to better collaborate and exchange with each other, learn each other's vocabulary. And this is why, at least from the peace side, we see a lot of opportunity to create a joint reflection about how do we position ourselves in order to expand broad-based economic opportunity in the places that most need it. Because what I think has not yet been mentioned, but what's very important, many conflict-affected and fragile states represent those countries that will face the highest levels of population growth in the coming decades, and by definition, therefore, also some of the most interesting frontier markets. So, if we do not team up in order to enhance broad-based economic opportunity, then who will? And I think Geneva is an incredible place to start this co-creation process in order to find joint solution on trade for peace.
Thank you, Hakim. So from the perspective of the ITC, finally, what is Trade for Peace about in your organization, and why is it important today?
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to be a part of this conversation this afternoon. I think the rationale behind the need for us to actually be able to link, trade and peace has been more than adequately addressed in the statements that were provided, but also in the context of the submissions that have been made by the panelists who have earlier spoken. And I just wanted to build on this by speaking to perhaps 3-4 quick points. One is that from our perspective, we take the view that economic performance and peace are interlinked, and I think DG spoke to this aspect in greater detail. They're not only interlinked, but they are mutually reinforcing, as we would see that. Why is this particularly important? It provides the opportunity for us to bring or to realize the benefits of trade and development, and in so doing that we are contributing to the development efforts that are being made by the countries. I think the important point to make here is the fact that the concreteness of what we do will determine the value that is associated to all the work that we have been doing. So whilst we have the discussions, we have the negotiations, and also the agreements, what really gets us the buy-in from those that we are working with, and in particular the constituencies at the country level, will be determined by what can concretely be able to be delivered on the ground. And this is where institutions such as ourselves come in. This is where institutions such as the partnership that we are speaking to right now becomes important, because it's very clear not a single entity can be able to respond to the needs on the ground, or indeed be able to deliver to the level of expectations or the needs that are demanded of us. So as an organization, we set out to work with the different entities that we partner with on the ground. And speaking directly to the aspect of accession, it is to us a starting point. We should always look at this as a point of entry that enables all the partners to position themselves to be able to deliver. And from ITC perspective, we look at this from a private sector lens. So we are working very much in line with our mandate, which is about enhancing competitiveness of micro, small, and medium enterprises, to ensure that not only are we making private sector aware of what is to come through the process of accession, but also positioning these entities to be able to take full advantage of what will come before them once they have acceded. Why are small and micro enterprises important? 90% of the country's economies are ones that are driven by small and medium enterprises. 60% of the job opportunities are actually created by these entities. So it becomes critical that we are focusing on that particular aspect as we go in. One point I quickly wanted to make is that whilst we very much focus the discussion in the context of accession, which is really, really important, we need to ensure that we understand that it's not an event. It's going to be a process that takes long, and some of these countries are actually going to take 10 steps back from those that we have taken with them. And we must understand this is the reality of least developed countries, whether in a conflict situation or not, the capacity is not there. And that is why we have to be there to collectively give that hand-holding. Perhaps I could end by saying we're very much present in all the countries that were referred to in the statement made by the Director General, and we closely work with these countries, with the WTO, with many other partners, in trying to ensure that we get to a point where we are really not only giving the hand-holding, but that transaction actually happens. Perhaps I'll speak a little bit more in detail to what it is that we have done later on. Thank you.
Wonderful. I think that really explains very clearly, to me at least, what trade and peace building is about and why it's important for both sides of the spectrum. I want to go a little bit deeper now and gauge the state of play in each of these two worlds, because we have heard it already that opinions and examples on the relationship between trade and peace differ. And I think we have to be honest that in some ways, in some situations, trade and economic connections, interdependence between or within countries have contributed to peace. The DG already mentioned the famous saying by Frédéric Bastiat, if goods cross borders, soldiers will not. And I think domestically, it really is amazing how about half of the countries wanting to accede to the WTO or fragile and conflict-affected states and consider WTO accession, both the process and WTO disciplines, as something that can foster peace within their territories. Stability, transparency, predictability. So things that can contribute to peace building. Now, on the other hand, there's also a lot of examples, a lot of commentators who view economic interdependence as a source of conflict rather than peace. And if we are interconnected, dependent on each other, that may create tensions. I was reading a piece by Jeffrey Garten in the International Economy and struck by one sentence where he says, global interdependencies are now our #1 national security threat. So the idea of being connected is considered here as a security threat. Bob Lighthizer, the former US trade representative in foreign affairs, also really highlighted that interdependence does not always lead to peace, in his view. And he mentioned a couple of examples, but referring to economic ties between the North and the South in the US, which didn't prevent a civil war, or Japan's dependence on raw materials from the US, which, in his view, motivated Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. And of course, also within countries, within many of the countries we've heard about, trade, often illicit trade, think of conflict diamonds, can fuel or perpetuate conflict and internal strife. So I'm a little bit torn between these two extremes, how it can help or hinder. And I'd like to probe or get some views from your organizations as to what is the most recent data, the research, what does it say? What's the predominant view in your organization or the region of the world you're from? And perhaps, if we can, what factors or variables have contributed to a positive rather than a negative relation between trade and peace? And I don't know whether there's general lessons or whether everything is really country or sector specific. And I'm really looking forward to hearing some concrete examples or elements that can help in that more positive relationship. Akim, can I start with you this time to change the order a little bit?
Sure. So I dedicated a big part of my academic life to the studying of war economies. And what is very recurrent is that the economies during times of war never stop. It just changes. So there are new monopolies that form, there are new control structures, there's demand and supply that changes. But I think this notion that when war starts, there's a black box that emerges, that we need to put to one side. So there is always trade for peace, therefore is always a topic. Whether it is to reduce the abusive impact of badly managed trade or badly managed investment, one should say, or if it is at the end of a conflict, when parties are tired, when it is about removing these padlocks that are locking up economies and that are preventing economies from flourishing. Now, in one capacity, I'm also an advisor to the OECD on the economic resilience in Yemen at the moment, and I've been an advisor last year of the EU on the economic dimensions of the peace process. And it was very clearly here how important the politics of trade for peace is, which means it's the politics around this unlocking of certain sectors, the politics of de-escalating the conflict around the economy, because at least in this case and in many other cases, the economy becomes part of an issue. And here, what is the good story in all this is that there is a convergence around joint interests on reducing some of the padlocks. And now, what is the from an international organization perspective here, and from the many organizations and governments that were part of these processes, very frequently, it is difficult to work on the politics of trade for peace because it tends to be a technical issue. And this is where, again, the diversity of the trade for peace angle becomes extremely interesting, where you can have spaces where you speak on technical issues, and you have spaces where you have speak on the politics and the high politics sometimes, which is involved on trade for peace. So if one looks at the evidence that comes out of the exits of war economies, I think what at least the academic analysis of these of many conflict areas shows is that you need to marriage the political dexterity to work on the political economy of post-conflict reconstruction, and you need to have the technical competence to really prepare a vision for the future that can become a source of common ground.
Wonderful, thank you. Perhaps I can turn to Ms. Tembo now to tell us a bit about the state of play, not from the research, but from your concrete projects. And you already mentioned that sometimes you see a positive correlation, and sometimes countries go back a few steps. So perhaps with practical examples, can you enlighten us on what the ITC has experienced?
Thank you. I wanted to come to the point of dependency. In my view, that's unavoidable. And I think the current context actually makes us see why that interdependency must be there. I think for me, it's how you connect and the rules that govern that dependency, that dependency, if I should say that. I think we are seeing this very nicely in the context of Africa, where countries have gotten together and are pushing forward a continental free trade area that will give tremendous opportunities that have never seen before, only if they get the framework right. And indeed, there's a serious commitment towards implementing that so that each and every country, dependent on where their strengths lie, they can take advantage of that. I think the second point I wanted to make is that the point that was made earlier on, which relates to our experiences in as far as these countries are concerned. Even in the worst case scenario, there is always continuity of trade. Some kind of trade happens. I think what we have observed is that what tends to happen in such circumstances is that you have trade which is skilled towards facilitating those that are trying to maximize profit and not necessarily using very conventional ways of doing this, or indeed ways that are consistent with any commitments that they may have in place. And this is where, for me, the multilateral context becomes extremely important. If we can push forward and make sure that there's predictability and try to support the enterprises to be able to do business in a way that is transparent and predictable, that is very helpful. What specific examples do we give? We have worked in the many countries that I referred to, which were spoken to by DG. But one example of a country where we have done this is Liberia. And in Liberia, between 1980, where GDP was almost $900, and it went down to almost 300, with them moving forward with the accession and a lot of work being done by the partners, like we did in the context of the UN cluster, and they did many other initiatives, we have seen that GDP going up to about $600 in 2020. What is it that we specifically did? We moved forward with ensuring that beyond the accession, we were working with the different sectors to not only give them a very clear understanding as to what was pertaining, but also ensuring that collectively we are getting the necessary resources to move forward for them to be able to actually obtain concrete gains from this. Finally, the point I wanted to make is one I referred to. The fragility of these countries cannot be ignored. And our main lesson from many of these countries is that we have to entrench in our planning and programming the risk management dimension. DDG spoke to Afghanistan. That is a country where we were very much active until the last few weeks, where we have now been challenged, made a lot of gains because everybody was rallying behind and providing the necessary resources. But that's the reality of what could happen in many, what could happen or what happens in some of the countries. Even just those health-related aspects. In the case of Liberia, we had Ebola come in the middle of us trying to implement. That in itself created a problem in terms of advancing the gains. But what is important is that the country itself recognized that they had to overcome this, and working with the different partners, we have moved on to a point where we seem to be past the worst, but of course there's still a lot to be consolidated going forward.
Thank you, Ambassador Zhang. What is, from the perspective of the WTO and perhaps your former role as Chinese ambassador to the WTO, your view on the state of play or this interaction, and on which side do you see examples more than others, or what variables can make it a positive interaction? Ambassador.
Okay, I'm familiar with the remarks you quoted, especially like the hazards. But as far as I know, there are different views on that. But the people like me, like Maika, Mariam, the colleague of mine, we belong to the group of people who believe that trade can make our world a better place. And I can give you my personal experience. Several years ago, I was the Vice Minister responsible for Sino-US trade relationship in China during Obama administration. And I kept saying that the trade is the ballast of the Sino-US relationship, because we assume that among all the elements in the Sino-US relationship, ideology, military, human rights, and trade is the only element that we can negotiate to each other. We can make an exchange to each other. But for the other elements, it's not possible. But during Donald Trump administration, there was the trade war between China and the US. So some people argue that what you said is not true, because trade is the origin of the conflict. But I would like to argue this is an artificial phenomenon. There's a root cause behind the trade war. For example, the failure of the government to make a domestic adjustment of the allocation of the benefit of globalization, so on and so forth. But we still believe that trade can play the stabilizing role in the major countries' trade relationship. If you go to the exhibition hall in Shanghai Import Expo, the Americans hall, the largest one, is very crowded, and thousands of people are there bargaining about their deal. So there are still there are dynamic between the relationship China and the United States at this day. So I think if the two countries real decouple, that's the disaster not only for China and for US, it's the disaster for the rest of the world. And Dorothy just mentioned the case of Afghanistan. Yes, several weeks ago we celebrated in Geneva of the 5th anniversary of Afghanistan's accession to the WTO. In the past 5 years, we witnessed the Afghanistan's people worked very hard in implementing, their commitment in the WTO accession deal, and they keep their trade policy liberalized, consistent with WTO rules. When we celebrate that, all of a sudden there was a dramatic change of the political regime in Afghanistan. But I still want to say that, the root, the seed sown in the soil, in the trade reform, will take root and bear fruit someday. We need to treasure the effort, and peace is something fragile. My hobby in Geneva is to collect some ceramic in the Ballon Bleu. And once I bought a beautiful vase made in 19th centuries. And when I brought back to China, at the last minute in the airport, I was knocked by some people and it was broken. So that's the nature of peace. It's fragile, but we need to continue, our efforts to, make the sustainable trade within our capacity, and at the same time, we need to recognize the nature of peace. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm keeping an eye on time. We have about 25 minutes left, and perhaps I'll combine my last two questions and then turn to Q&A. We've heard about why this is important and what is new, what is keeping you busy on these topics, the state of play. I want to make it a bit more concrete now and ask for deliverables. What is it that you think this agenda in the next 5 or 10 years can really deliver? Is it bringing communities together? Is it specific projects on the ground? Is it perhaps domestic best practices or looking at processes that have worked? Or do you also think that, for example, at the level of international rules, certain changes need to be implemented so that the multilateral trading system can really help these countries? I couldn't help but notice that President Ramos Horta, he was quite critical of the current trading system, referring to the fact that it benefited only a few while depriving a majority of others. So in terms of deliverables, in terms of making this work, in terms of bringing these communities together, what is it that we can expect from you? What is it that people can really expect coming out of this agenda on the ground? Perhaps I can now start with you, Ms. Tembo, because you really have a lot of on-the-ground experience.
I perhaps will confine my comments to what we are seeing on the ground, even though I could dare perhaps comment, having been part of the negotiations a long time ago. The bottom line is things have really changed. Where are we coming from? It is understandable that in certain respects, because of the specificities of the different countries, they will be different needs. But what is important, in my view, is that all countries ensure that they remain at the table to register what challenges that come with some of the decisions that are being taken, because if you're not at the table, nobody's going to take your concerns into account. So ensuring that there is that consistency. But coming back specifically to the issues on the ground, it's very clear. One of the challenges I think we have had in the context of the strategic partnerships that we have developed or are trying to develop has been that sometimes we see each other more as competitors rather than, that we can work together in a complementary way. And in my view, I think this particular context has shown that actually to some extent, we can work together and we can try to build on that. Because what we don't need is really trying to duplicate efforts, which tends to happen sometimes. We need to have more coordination to try and ensure that we are addressing that. But we also need to have more cohesion. What we must remember is that those countries that we are working with are ones that are particularly challenged. Having 10 people coming to speak about the same thing can be very challenging. If we were to coordinate, not only in terms of the engagement on the dialogue side, but also in terms of the planning and programming, as well as leveraging of resources which have increasingly become scarce, I think it makes sense for us to do that. On the other side, for the countries, I think there has to be more ownership assumption. We can come in as partners, but if we have to have sustainable interventions, the countries need to make sure that they're moving along with us and they know that at some point, we will probably have less and less of the hand-holding and they will need to assume more of that ownership. Being inclusive in all the engagement that we have, whether it's from our side or indeed the country side of things, is equally important. So 2 specific recommendations in responding to the 2 questions. One is that as an initiative, we think a very good effort has been made. The fact that we are having this annual conversation is in itself a reflection of not only the importance of what we are dealing with, but also what can be achieved when people work together. What is it that we would see going forward? Consolidation on the collaboration and indeed perhaps on the scope of what this particular initiative can do would be very, very useful. So gathering, for instance, insight from experts and practitioners in trade, in peace, in humanitarian communities to establish trade policy measures and best practices would be one sphere that we could look at. Secondly, I think it is very clear from all the interventions I've heard this afternoon that we would need to make sure that the small businesses become an integral part of our process. And for these businesses, we know they're challenged in many, many ways. Trying to find ways of collectively working together to try and address that will be key. It's important for the recovery process, but it's also important going forward, going back to what I had said, which was that they are central to any effective functioning or delivery of an economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Zhang. What is it that the WTO aims at with its initiative?
With regard to the possible deliveries, I think at this moment, the knowledge sharing is still the key. And we talk about to break silos, but what's in the silo? I agree. What's in the silos? You used to work in the legal division of WTO. What's wrong of the lawyers who are familiar with the calculation of the margin of dumping? And there's nothing wrong for them. They can help the members to address the trade dispute, but it's not enough. We need to break the silos to share their knowledge, their expertise with others. And those people working in the silos, they need to know the world is changing. There are many new things. We need to help the countries, especially from the developing world, to adapt to the new changes, the technology transformation. So I think the awareness, knowledge is the key at this moment. So last August we launched the Trade for Peace research hub, and we issue a call for a paper. We would like to collect the paper by October, and then to make a publication. We hope this is part of the effort of the Trade for Peace initiative to help the people to understand more about the implication and the understanding of this initiative. But we have to recognize we have limited knowledge at this moment. In the peace building, we can only rely on experts like Akim, like you, to help us to understand more from what perspective and trade can be pieced together in the framework of peace building. From our knowledge, there are a lot of elements in trade which are related to the sustainable development, sustainable peace. For example, trade facilitation and MIS, empower of women. But we don't know yet how to, connect those initiatives in the WTO with this peace building. That's something we are missing. So, Akim, I think in this regard, you can play a very important role.
Akim, what is it from the perspective of the peace builders, the humanitarian community, that this kind of discussion could deliver? What are they missing or waiting for?
And it feels like a peace process where you have many different constituencies who come with their own visions, ideas, and framings of the world, which you are through a process bringing together into a joint destiny. Because if we're looking at the notion of what the core business of peace processes is to accept your differences, understand where the other one comes from, and find together moments of collaboration, and even where there are opportunities to do things together, even though you are not the same. And this is what the heart of a peace process is about. And so Trade for Peace, or let's say even if we expand the cycle, working in the area of trade, peace, labor, and humanitarian work, which all intersect in the countries that we've been talking about. The first starting point is understanding how the other makes sense of the world. So this, in our world, we make this through co-creation processes, which take time, which take a lot of listening, understanding also the intellectual roots of how each discipline and how each constituency makes sense of itself. Sometimes these intellectual foundations have then been institutionalized in departments or so forth, which need to be recognized, but as a foundation for demystification, so that you know the other, you get to know the other. This is, I think, so the first next step is the one of co-creation. When 3 years ago with the Accessions division, we started talking, when I was still at the Geneva Peacebuilding Platform, we saw also there is no integrated knowledge base. They are either great trade experts, great peace experts, or they're great humanitarians, or they're great labor experts. But this kind of joint understanding is not there yet. So also from the Graduate Institute point of view, I think we see a possibility to start with a new generation and have a course on Trade for Peace at the Graduate Institute at a master's level, in addition to perhaps at the executive education level. But if we are going now from this sphere of reflection to a somewhat more operational one, you heard me say that from a peace building perspective, it's all about the politics of moving things in places. Part of this getting to know each other is also about understanding the complementarity of the networks that each community has. And at least here in this town, in the peace side, we like to praise ourselves that Geneva is the only place in the world that has second-degree connection to any armed actor anywhere in the world. and be that government, non-state, or any other private armed actors. And that is a complementarity that is necessary for this unlocking of closed access economy, which is a political economy framing that the World Bank developed to describe, among others, conflict-affected and fragile states. And then understanding the capabilities, the connectedness that actors have in Geneva, both in the humanitarian but also in the peace-building side, might be important. If I may, just as an example of what can be done, I think if one takes up a problem-solving approach to making this connectedness work, it might be interesting to look at one example in Yemen right now. If one thinks that the port of Hodeidah has really no crane infrastructure to get containers out, then also one might understand the difficulties of supplying great parts of the country with goods. With goods. It takes 2 years to get new cranes up. But this through a problem-solving initiative could be perhaps reduced to a year, so that when there is an ease of access to the port of Hodeidah, which is currently sanctions, one can more quickly get goods into the market. Then coming to the politics, if there are more goods in the market, one also needs to negotiate that the roads leaving from Hodeidah port, there is not a checkpoint every once in a while that is, in fact, then increases the costs of trade tremendously, which in itself is a political process. So this trade facilitation in this context means that you need to have access to a different set of constituents that the usual trade portfolio you have not access to. So that's just as a concrete example of how these mutual relationships can help to support each other.
Wonderful. I think it's time for questions now. A lot of issues have been mentioned, examples, tensions, state of play issues, what could come out of this agenda. So I don't know whether we can offer some more light, literally, in the room, and then also, if I see hands up, I can give you the floor. Wonderful. Let me take 2 or 3 questions and then turn to the panel. And perhaps, Dimitri, if you have questions online, you can field them as well. The gentleman there and then the gentleman there, please. I think a microphone will come to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, trade for peace, it's the main pillar for the future negotiations in WTO, yes. And the fishery aspect, it's problematic. If we see the case of North Africa, in Morocco littoral, it is accepted by EU. By the littoral in Western Sahara, it's not a decision by EU because Western Sahara is not part of the EU on behalf of the international law. And it is not the main problematic between the bilateral relationship between Morocco and Algeria. We see also case of Yemen. It's very edificant case because Yemen joined WTO in 2010 and 1 year later started an armed conflict. And we see the usefulness. But I want to be concise in my intervention. Yes, fragile state, but in the international negotiation, it's more clear. LDC's group, LDCC's group, least developed countries, least development connected countries. Yes, for the previous 10 years, there was targeted, and the targeted were clear to reduce LDC's group to the half. There is 13 countries, least development in Africa, 33 in Africa, sorry, 13 in Asia, and only 1 in Western Hemisphere, Haiti, and still armed conflict in Haiti. Yes, how for the future, next 10 years, because the international meeting hosting this year, how we should introduce trade for peace, and what will be the new targeted? Because if we see, for example, conflict in Libya, South Sudan, Mali, in Africa, for example, how those countries didn't already achieve their negotiations to join WTO. Even if those negotiations started since 20 years ago, mature negotiations. I prefer stopping here.
Thank you. Thank you for the panelists. It was very interesting to hear the different point of view, and also what you mentioned, there's some conflicts happening. I'm the first person who was appointed by Ramos Horta to head the embassy here in Geneva. I remember what he says at the end, did we do such a good job? And an evening at his home, we were discussing this, and it says this, that even if we are trying to help countries and things like this, and there's a lot of NGOs who are doing that job, we are not listening to the culture of those countries, and we miss the point. And we sometimes just creating more problem. Okay, he mentioned that the countries have everything, the developing countries have everything to provide. But yet, that's exactly what you say, the problem. You follow the petroleum trail and you see how many conflicts are issued out of this, or the water, or other things, gold, diamonds, and whatever, okay? These are some of the problem. The real power behind this is not the soldier on the field making the wars and things like this. This is in the secret rooms, dining rooms of bankers, of big corporations. These are the ones who are deciding. This is where the power, secret power is, and moving the thing. The UN was here to represent we the people, but it doesn't represent really the people. It represents governments. But there is some hope, because we the people, they're working through the transnational, through this big corporation at the general board meetings. They're pointing out the difficulties, the child abuse, the women's, and so on. And they ask those corporations to do something about this. And I think that's a good point. You know, that's where we should really emphasize a little bit. I have so much to say, but.
Thank you. Very interesting reflections. Are there other questions from the room? Yes, sorry.
Hello, Hannes Schlillmann of WT Advisors. Thank you so much for this very inspiring discussion. 3 quick points. The first one is, Joost, you mentioned best practice. In the context of accession, but also beyond accession, one of the things I always say first when I go and advise and are faced with the looks that say, oh, do we have to implement all of that? I say, actually, 99.2% of the WTO rulebook is best practice you want to do anyway. So take it as an opportunity to engage in a discussion about that. And if there are 2 or 3 things you do want to do differently, let's talk. But this is very, very useful. Thinking of Achim's point about developing the technical competence to develop a vision. WTO accession is a glorious opportunity for the government to start thinking as a team, because everything is connected with everything. And WTO accession is a great place to start discussing that if you haven't done it yet. But as Dorothy pointed out, that's just the start. So it's a process that leads to more process. In fact, that's when you can start building on the basis of that. So I would say best practice is one of the great opportunities that come from engaging with trade systems and the trade system. Second point, much faster. We need to think of trade as a provider of perspectives. Now, we talk about natural resources, that's all true. The president did, some of us in the room did. I want to highlight something that is equally, perhaps more important, which is people. People and what they can do, and that often translates into services. Services trade, in my view, is still vastly underrated in the discussions. Services provide perspectives to young people, the people who actually need to maintain the peace. Services provide opportunities for SMEs, both as providers of services and as users of services. I sat once in a taxi in Lebanon, and the taxi driver couldn't put up an online map, and as a result, we didn't find the Ministry of Finance because he couldn't pay for the online access. I only found out when we didn't find the ministry. That is ridiculous, right? So the service provider, he was hindered in his delivery to me, which would make me take a much higher paid service next time. Third point, responsibilities. We haven't really talked about it too much. I might have missed it in the first presentation. Responsibilities, and these are the ones that are not perhaps automatically provided. Responsibility to provide or to supply. We had a lot of that discussion when the epidemic hit us, and I think we are really doing badly so far. I think there is the trade system as such needs to expand to a much broader vision of an obligation to supply. And the second aspect, and I end there, is the obligation to buy. We're not buying enough from least developed countries. And again, services. I've recently been involved in a gracious initiative of a developed country in Europe trying to see what services they could buy from least developed countries. We need everyone to do that because it's good business and because it's great in building perspectives and eventually peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Not sure there were concrete questions in the three remarks, but I want to give the opportunity to our panel to quickly respond and then take some questions from the online participants. Ambassador Zhang, yes.
Maybe I would like to make a response to the accession of the African countries to the WTO. Yes, there are dozens of African countries not WTO members. So it's fair to say that Africa is the only continent which is not fully integrated into the multilateral trading system, especially in the Horn of Africa. There are some major economies like Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan, not WTO members, but they are all in the accession process. I used to be in Ethiopia 3 times. There are many industry parks. Their economy was very dynamic several years ago. And even some neighboring African countries sent a delegation to learn from the experience of Ethiopia. But now they have some problems. I think in this perspective that WTO's accession process can help those African countries to push forward the domestic institutional reform to legalize the outcome of their reform. But as I said, I am very reluctant to establish the causal linkage between WTO accession and economic development. Taking China as an example, this year marks China's 20th anniversary of WTO accession. China enjoy rapid economic growth after its accession to the WTO, but it's not the case for other developing countries. So I assume that WTO's accession can play its role together with many other elements. It cannot play its single role individually to help the country to achieve the sustainable goal. So when the domestic institutional reform merged together with its efforts to be integrated into the global economy and multilateral trading system, there's a possibility for those countries to be benefited in this process. Thank you.
A quick response to the comments made, or can we please, Hakim, Dorothy?
Just briefly, because there are more questions up from the comment from the gentleman up there on the sometimes the unintended impacts of big investment projects and so forth, which you mentioned. I think there is an opportunity to look at the notion of conflict sensitivity. This is very mainstream work, at least in the development world, and also in the investment world, to in fact assess what is the impact of your investment or the development project on conflict dynamics, and hence the notion of conflict sensitive trade might be something to dig a little bit deeper on. 4 years ago, I wrote a little paper on that. So that triggered this elements. Plus, there is a lot of work currently ongoing in the private sector around the ESGs and principles for responsible investment and so forth. So that might be another connecting point, particularly here in Geneva, where this will be a big topic in the Building Bridges conference between the financial community and the SDG implementation. But also to your comment on services, I think yes, this is a very important confidence building measure and a very important element to study deeper. In our world, we see surely more terrorist organizations and rebel groups that are tremendously digitally savvy. And primarily in order to make their war fighting or their strategies more efficient. So as part of a transformation of these groups, building on this capacity to facilitate digital trade or digital applications, I think there is something to work on in order to use this topic as a bridge builder. The same with tourism, because some conflict-affected and fragile states or even war areas are in pristine areas. And so how one can build these and find the investments also to assure that there are possibilities for tourism development might also be an entry point for Trade for Peace collaborations. Dorothy?
Thank you. Very quickly, I just wanted to come back to two issues. I think on services, I couldn't agree that from our work and the research that we have done, that is where the demand or the need really is. And I think fully recognized by all countries. Each and every delegation of the 122 countries that we are working in have put before us the request to actually work with them in the area of services and looking at it from both sides. Very quickly, the point relating to countries not buying enough from developing countries, I think we have to look more critically as to what is really available and whether this can actually be goods or products that can actually be, supplied. Perhaps if you look at a continent that I'm more familiar with coming from there, Africa, a market of 1 billion people, but amongst themselves, the trade is less than 10% because they are all producing raw materials. So the task then becomes, how can you add value so that you are able to actually not only diversify your exports, but also perhaps look at getting a much higher value for that. And the final point on market requirements, which relates maybe in part to a point which was raised in terms of some of the difficult issues that may be coming up in the context of perhaps those that are buying or those that are trying to supply. Essentially, the point I'm trying to make there, from our perspective, we have noticed that current conversations are extending beyond tariffs and internationally acceptable standards. We are finding conversations going more and more in the direction of addressing ourselves to issues relating to labor. And these I'm seeing in the coming months, or more so in the coming years, will become a central part of the discussion, and they will have to be met. And I think this is an aspect that countries have to take into account, but also very much coming from those that are providing funding for many of the countries that are receiving technical assistance, that this becomes an integral part of the conversation, because it's being demanded by their own constituencies, particularly the parliamentarians. Thanks.
Interesting. We are already a couple of minutes over time, but it would be interesting if we could get a sense of what people online are thinking or saying, and then a quick final word from each of you, if you can. Thank you.
That's an absolutely huge question. I definitely doesn't have time to tackle what can trade policy do to facilitate peace in the Pacific region, given the tensions between US and China, which I don't think you can cover in 30 seconds. Questions about the current state of the multilateral peace, relationship between multilateral trade and peace building as compared to when the institutions were being built after World War II. But we do have a rather sort of compact and I think positive looking question from Shweta Nambiar, whose name I'm sure I've butchered. They say, hello, thank you for this insightful session. How can silos be broken down within the cross organizations to collaborate on trade for peace? And specifically, how can we help capacity building at different levels, whether that be university courses, training for diplomats, trade and peace practitioners coming together. I think that would be a nice place to throw back to the panel.
Okay, a couple of really difficult and then more easier questions. Perhaps, 10 seconds each as your final words, the takeaway you really want to leave us with. Perhaps we can start with Akim at the end and then come back here.
I leave the Pacific to you, but I think to sum up, I think in Geneva we have a real opportunity on trade for peace. Partly because of the history of the city to be a connector, and partly because of our proximity to not just the trade and peace community, but to all the issues and the connectedness of Geneva to so many places. So we from the Institute, we're looking forward to collaborating on making this exchange and this nexus real, and to walking the walk of the co-creation together with all of you.
On the Pacific issue, I think different mechanisms can play a different role. For example, the bilateral mechanism, the regional mechanism, and the multilateral trading system. But I think the WTO's role cannot be replaced by the other mechanism. I call for the countries to attach great importance to the WTO trade negotiations. For example, subsidy issues cannot be addressed by regional mechanism or bilateral mechanism, and the other issues like climate change, environment issues. So we hope that we can achieve some deliverables in the upcoming MC12. With regard to the Trade for Peace initiative, I think we are in an initial stage. We have to confess that we have limited knowledge. So we are very pleased to be involved in this peace building framework. We are in a learning curve, so we would like to take a humble manner to learn from other colleagues and institutions to try to make our contribution in this process. Thank you.
Dorothy, final words?
Huge opportunity, I think, for the Geneva partners. But the point I would want to add to that is that this is about what we do in Geneva, and it is as important in relation to what we do with the countries themselves, because we might have all the answers or understanding of the situation, but if the countries are not aligned, we will not be able to achieve that. And here, the silo breaking is imperative, both from our side and indeed from the countries. But there are also some existing mechanisms that we can build on. If I look at many of the LDCs that we are working with, they do have structures that have been created, for instance, in the context of the enhanced integrated framework. I think the issue that we would have to deal with there is making sure that the composition is one that relates to what we would need in terms of pushing forward this particular initiative. So let's continue to work together. These are countries that are really in need. Each and every step we make makes a difference for somebody on the ground. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. With this, I'd like to thank all three of our panelists, you in the room and the people online. Before we applaud them, just to know that in less than 20 minutes, we have our next panel, an update on what's happening on environmental issues at the WTO. Thank you all very, very much.